Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to our event today on transforming business beyond COVID-19. My name is Genevieve Smith, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership, Egal for short, here at Berkeley Haas. Today, we have a wonderful lineup of speakers to discuss the topic of equitable recovery, including a fireside chat between Dean Ann Harrison of Berkeley Haas and Lieutenant Governor of California, Eleni Kounalakis, followed by an incredible panel. Before delving into the fireside chat, I wanted to share some background on this topic and introduce a resource that we developed at Egal. As everyone is well aware, COVID-19 is having a devastating impact on individuals, communities, and economies globally. It's exposing staggering inequality in the US. COVID-19 has deeply impacted workers of color and women. People of color and women are more likely to be in close contact with COVID-infected individuals in the workplace. This is because of the industries in which they work, their higher likelihood of being considered essential workers, and their lack of flexible work arrangements, all of which restrict their ability to telework during COVID-19. People of color and women are also more likely to suffer job losses during COVID-19. Some of you may have seen the latest jobs report that shows that 275,000 women, particularly women of color, left the US labor force in January, and women accounted for almost 80% of US adults who stopped working or looking for work in January. Working women have now lost more than 3 decades of labor force gains in less than a year. People of color and women are also less likely to be making a living wage and less likely to have access to healthcare and job benefits, including paid sick leave and childcare, with women, particularly Latina and Black women, shouldering large childcare and elder care responsibilities. Lastly, people of color and women are more likely to own businesses that will be closing. This impact to workers creates more dire consequences for business and society, which in turn further exacerbate the risks workers face to their health and livelihoods. The pandemic, while devastating, also offers a once-in-a-generation opportunity to address this inequality and to rebuild business and the workplace in disruptive and courageous ways. To help facilitate this, at Egal, we developed a playbook for business leaders to transform business priorities, policies, and approaches beyond COVID-19. In the media and in corporate communications, equitable recovery is often focused on returning to the previous normal and the workplace that already existed. But it's clear that what we need is not to return to normal, not at all. In fact, it's about moving to a new normal that seeks to integrate equity, not just into the return itself, but in the very fabric of how businesses operate. We call this equity fluent recovery. Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation, captures the spirit of equity fluent recovery well. Corporate America can no longer get away with token responses to systemic problems. It's going to take a systemic response to sufficiently address this crisis that's been decades in the making. There are 12 plays for business leaders we outline for an equity fluent recovery. The first play starts with the courage to change yourself as a leader. This play recognizes that leadership is a series of active choices, and pursuing an equitable recovery won't happen without leaders who choose to be bold, to use their power to tear down barriers and drive change. Leaders who prioritize purpose, inclusion, vulnerability, and compassion. The next 3 plays are extensions of some actions already instituted by corporations during COVID-19. They focus on critical job benefits that are needed for workers of color and female workers today, were needed before, and will be needed beyond the pandemic, including paid leave, living wage, and worker relief funds. The following 5 plays begin to create the necessary environment and resources to reach a recovery that accelerates racial and gender equity well into the future, including creating pathways for worker growth, supporting worker voice, committing to enabling caretaking, investing in small business partners, and embedding equity and inclusion in products and services. The final 3 plays promote systemic changes to leadership and power structures that exist at companies. They create exponential opportunities for people of color and women. These include pushing for long-term executive pay structures, stopping stock buybacks, and instituting co-determination models. So with that, I would like to introduce or turn it over to our fireside panel. And, turn it over to our fireside channel. I'm thrilled today to welcome Dean Ann Harrison and Lieutenant Governor of California, Eleni Kounalakis. Dean Ann Harrison is the 15th Dean of the Haas School of Business. A renowned economist, she has dedicated her career to creating inclusive and sustainable policies in development economics, international trade, and global markets. Dean Harrison came to Haas from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, where she was a professor of multinational management and business economics and public policy. Before joining Wharton in 2012, she was the director of development policy at the World Bank. Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis was sworn in as the 50th Lieutenant Governor of California on January 7, 2019. She's the first woman elected to the Lieutenant Governor of California. In addition to her duties as Lieutenant Governor, she's California's representative for international affairs and trade. From 2010 to 2013, she served as President Barack Obama's ambassador to the Republic of Hungary. She was the first Greek-American woman, and at age 43, one of America's youngest, to serve as US ambassador. Lastly, and very importantly, Eleni is a Haas alum herself, earning her MBA from Haas in 1992. Go Bears. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dean Harrison.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so delighted, Eleni, to have this opportunity to ask you these questions. And I should also point out that our Lieutenant Governor is also on our Haas board, which I'm really excited about. So let me start with the first question. It's clear that business as usual is not working for the vast majority of Americans. So this is a two-part question. First, could this be the right time to redesign business? And second, can capitalism be a vehicle to advance equity and inclusion?
Well, Dean Harrison, it is such an honor and a pleasure to be here with you. Let me just start by recognizing Genevieve Smith and how succinctly and well she has framed the issue of the day. But I think it's also important to note that income inequality has been growing now over decades. I am a very big fan of Professor Robert Reich. He signed my diploma actually in college, and I've been following him and his work ever since. He produced a film not too long ago called Inequality for All. And if anyone really just wants to have a very clear, but also a deep dive into understanding how we got here, I really recommend it. And we are now in a circumstance, again, it is no secret to anyone, where the top 1% are doing very well. Enormous amounts of wealth have been concentrated in the top in the United States. And especially with the fourth industrial revolution, especially with the global pandemic of COVID-19, those who are in the middle class are having more difficulty staying there, seeing their prospects and their children's prospects diminish. And those who are struggling the most just to be able to keep a roof over their head and food on the table are having a harder problem than ever. And again, as Genevieve points out, women and underrepresented groups are disproportionately negatively impacted by all these things. So a couple of things in the era of COVID that I would note. One is that top income earners are actually doing great. We did not know at the state level that this would be the case. In fact, the May revise of the 2020 budget anticipated a massive decrease in the amount of funds that go into the general fund. And so last year's budget in the May revise was, we used up, intended to use up all of the rainy day fund, massive cuts to programs, no new programs are being funded. And lo and behold, when the numbers came in, we found that for this year, in fact, we would have a $15 billion budget surplus. This is primarily a result of the fact that stock market is at historic highs, that there have been record numbers of IPOs in California in 2020. We saw statistics like Silicon Valley had 43 startups worth more than $1 billion. And housing prices have gone up 17%. So all these indicators, and then of course, all these elements of how well the top income earners are doing has resulted in our having a budget surplus. That is extremely helpful in terms of our ability to help support those who are struggling the most. And the budget reflects, and I think Lenny Mendonca, who is California's chief economic advisor, will probably talk about this, but this year's state budget is designed to help those who are falling into the cracks, or who are having a harder time being able to put food on their table and a roof over their head. Important policies like extension of moratoriums on evictions have been extremely important to help people, as well as things we've never done before, a $600 stimulus paid for by the state. So we know we've had all this federal stimulus coming in. We've also had the opportunity, because of our $15 billion surplus, to give a $600 stimulus to families in California who qualify for their earned income tax credit. So top line in terms of where we are as a state under COVID, the top income earners are doing well. They're paying their personal income tax and paying taxes on, companies are paying taxes on income generated by all these IPOs. That money is being directed by the governor and hopefully by the legislature. The budget process is happening right now to get in there and help families who need the most help. So that's kind of the facts on the ground. So to your question, Dean Harrison, right now, capitalism is funding the ability to help those who are at the bottom. But this is not a sustainable solution. Using tax revenue to keep people's head above water is not a sustainable system in order to have a healthy democracy. What we need in a healthy democracy is to have a strong and empowered middle class and a pathway into the middle class that is based on economic security of a wide swath of our people. So that, I think, is where we are. We are doing okay at the moment, but over time, this is not a model that will ensure a strong society that will be able to ensure that our society and our democracy stays strong.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Eleni. Let me just continue in that vein. So as the Haas Dean, my top 3 priorities are actually innovation, inclusion, and sustainability. So sometimes we hear that the goal of innovation and inclusion might not necessarily coexist as well as we would like. So let me ask you a little bit more about what might be some priorities that the government, perhaps the state government or the federal government, could use to support those equity and inclusion goals while also balancing the need for innovation and economic growth.
Well, this is really the trick of American democracy. I worked for Secretary Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, and for most of her career, she talked about democracy as a 3-legged stool. That you have American democracy, that we have a belief that the capitalist system will advance innovation, which will benefit everyone, but that we also have a governmental system that will ensure that our capitalist system does not exploit our workers or poison our people. And then you have the 3rd leg of the stool, which is civil society, which is a body politic, an educated populace that is involved and active to ensure that the balance between capitalism and government is healthy. So there's a lot that we do all the time, but there are a couple of things that I certainly advocate. And one is, it concerns me, Dean Harrison, when I hear people in the private sector, particularly, I live in San Francisco, and I've heard this for a long time from people who've been in government for a long, people who've been successful in business for a long time, people who are in financial services, to young people who are, going into technology. They say things like, government is a necessary evil. And they have this mindset that government is something that you want to find holes in or work around or find those loopholes. And that worries me, because what I say to these people is, no. Government is you. In a democracy, in our democracy, this is government of the people, by the people, for the people. Everybody has to recognize that they have a stake in the system working and in government working. And all you have to do is go to a country where government doesn't work, where if you're in the private sector, you have to have your own militia in order to enforce contracts, instead of being able to rely on a transparent and a judicial system that functions and allows you to ensure that your contracts are going to be enforced, as an example. But there are a couple of other things I think that are kind of happening out there. You hear about the universal basic income. I think what's happening right now with federal stimulus, really focusing on basically just putting checks in people's hands as a way to stimulate the economy. I think these are things that economists are really looking at. But again, overall, there are some basic things. People need to be paid a living wage. We need to ensure that affordable health care is available. And then, of course, the final thing, which I spend most of my time talking about, is education. Half of the general fund of the state of California goes to education. A Berkeley study a couple of years back showed that for every dollar the state invests in education in California, we've had about a $4.50 return on our investment. And I can go on and on. I think I have a couple of recorded talks I've done about the importance of public higher education in the state of California, but we cannot underestimate what our system of public higher education has done for the state of California, both in propelling us to becoming the 5th largest economy in the world, but also being the incubator of innovation. One data point that I'll just give for folks who want to learn more about this is, if you look at our entire system, we have about 3 million students currently enrolled in public higher education. About 2.1 million of those are in community colleges. Of course, we can talk about the UC, we're convened by UC Berkeley, but it's the California State University system is really something to watch. We have about 500,000 students currently enrolled. CollegeNet does a social mobility index, and they survey something like 1,600 universities across the country. Of the top 20 highest ranking universities on the social mobility index, 14 of the 20 are California State University universities. So this is pretty amazing. And if you look at the profile of our students at the UC, 40% of our enrollment at the University of California are first generation students, first in their family to go to college. You know, I'm a testament of this. My grandmother in Greece never learned to read, never learned to write. My father came to California to work as a farm worker, went to Sac State. I went to UC Berkeley. It's meant everything to our family, and millions of California families are on this same pathway.
Thank you so much for that, Eleni. I share your wonder and enthusiasm for the California system. It's a major reason why I left my chaired professorship at Wharton to come back to California and work in our wonderful University of California system, which has done so much for social mobility in the United States. So let's just shift a little bit to a different kind of set of questions. One of the threads throughout this playbook that Genevieve describes so well is that society is attributing value incorrectly, including for workers. And that's reflected in stagnant real wages and lack of protections, particularly for workers in lower level positions or more unstable employment like contract work. Those positions are often filled by women and by people of color. So what should be done about this undervaluing of these kinds of positions by both the private sector and the public sector?
A couple of years back, as I was traveling the state of California, I went to all 58 counties, and it's remarkable when you tell people you're running for office, they will tell you their stories. I was in Santa Cruz and I met with a group of mothers, and they're strawberry pickers. And that's one of the hardest jobs. You're really, it's backbreaking work, and it has to be done by hand. And these were all migrant farm workers, and they were very concerned because they moved around. None of their kids could finish high school. And what they made clear to me is that they were willing to spend their life picking strawberries for very small wages. But they wanted to be sure that their kids were going to have a chance for something better. And the idea that their kids were going to end up being strawberry pickers too, they weren't willing to work in California under the conditions that they were required to work under in these jobs if they couldn't see a better life for their kids. And I give this story to people, particularly those listening, because, people are rational. These moms are rational, and they understand when and where there's opportunity for them and for their kids. The moment that a pathway forward for a better life doesn't exist for low-wage workers, we're not going to be California as we know ourselves. We're not going to be the United States. We absolutely have a stake in ensuring that the American dream and the California dream stay alive. Henry Ford was very innovative in his thinking and his corporate leadership. He massively increased the wages of his workers to the point where he said, my workers need to be able to afford the product that they're building. That's the kind of thinking that our corporate leaders need to get back to. These massive disparities between corporate pay and the pay of those at the highest and those at the bottom. Corporate leaders cannot turn a blind eye to this any longer because they are benefiting immensely from the architecture of the American system that educates workers, that keeps the peace, that keeps our country from devolving into chaos. They have got to recognize that this is on them. And as a result, they can't just think about, how much money they have compared to the billionaire down the hall. The culture of one-upping one another and having, more and more zeros after your net worth versus recognizing and having pride, I would say, in our system. I think that we've got to get back to that because it's not something that government, at least at this stage, can do alone. We have to have the buy-in of the private sector in order to be able to address these challenges.
I completely agree with you. Thank you so much, Lieutenant Governor. So we're nearing the end of our time, and we're going to have the panel next. So I'm going to ask you one last question. This last question is about promoting more inclusive leadership. I know when I became dean 2 years ago, the first thing I did was create a more diverse HOS board, appointing more women, appointing people of color to the board. And we've diversified some of our MBA programs, although we still have a long way to go. So California is a leader in terms of mandating diversity on boards, including mandating gender diversity and more recently, racial diversity. Do you think this is a reason to be optimistic?
Oh, I'm very optimistic. And there are a lot of great things going on. I think it's worth noting that we have two members of the UC Berkeley community who are on their way to be in the cabinet of President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, Janet Yellen and Jennifer Granholm. And then, of course, our small business administrator from California is headed back to be small business administrator in Washington, Isabel Guzman. We are also the home state of the first woman vice president in Kamala Harris. And then our speaker, Nancy Pelosi, also making us so proud. You referenced the SB 826, which mandates women on boards. It was at the very beginning, there was a lawsuit to try to stop its implementation. Just so people know what it is, it requires that at least that public companies in California have at least one woman on their board by 2019. And boards with 6 or more members have at least 3 women directors, and boards of 5 must have at least 2 directors by 2021. So that's coming up. But here's what's interesting. When the lawsuit hit, there were about 180 of the 650 public companies that had no women. 180 companies that met these requirements had no women. That was just 2 years ago. Today, there are only 15. So even before it was clear that it would be mandated, which it is, companies recognized, maybe they have a point. And I know Kelly McElhaney, it couldn't be with us today, but her research showing this connection between having women on boards and seeing companies meet their ESG goals is really very persuasive. So I think that the good news is that we have a pretty collaborative process in this state. So state mandates something, but companies say, maybe we should be doing this anyway. So a lot of good things are happening in this state, a lot of things that I'm very proud of. But I think that my bottom line message to the Haas community, which is so near and dear to my heart, my 2 years at Haas Berkeley were the 2 most important of my academic life. I'm incredibly grateful. I love Berkeley. I miss being on campus. But my number one message has always been, because I've been very politically involved. Right after I got my MBA, I went to Sacramento and worked for the California Democratic Party in 1992. My message to everyone in the community, whether it's students or faculty, is this democracy belongs to you. This system belongs to you. Be part of it. Understand how important the decisions that you make in the C-suite are overall to our system, and be proud of it too, because it is our democracy and our incredible system in California that has produced both our system of public higher education and made us the 5th largest economy in the world, and created a California dream, which we are all responsible for making sure stays alive.
Thank you so much, Lieutenant Governor, for those words. It's such a pleasure to have you here. I too am a product of that California dream. My parents couldn't afford anything, and so I came to Berkeley and got an amazing education as an undergraduate. And we really appreciate everything that you do and that you were able to join us here today. Thank you. And so now we're going to move to the next part of today's conversation.
Great. Well, thank you so much to Dean Harrison and Lieutenant Governor for that wonderful fireside chat. And again, go Bears. So with that, we're transitioning to our panel. Our panel is moderated by Guadalupe Manriquez, a Berkeley Haas 2021 MBA and Egal Student Advisory Board member. We also have Lenny Mendonca, the former Chief Economic and Business Advisor to the state of California and a Senior Partner Emeritus at McKinsey and Company. And lastly, Marcela Manubens, the Global VP of Integrated Social Sustainability at Unilever. With that, I'll hand it over to Lupe.
Great, thanks Genevieve. I'm very excited to be here with you all this morning, discussing really important issues around an equitable recovery with Lenny and Marcela. Just a quick reminder, we'll get to Q&A 10 minutes, the last 10 minutes of the panel. So I'll start us off with the first question that Dean Harrison asked the Lieutenant Governor. And Lenny, I know you had a recent article around this that you published recently with former Dean Tyson. So it's clear that business as usual isn't working for the vast majority of Americans. Do you think that this can be a time to redesign business? And can capitalism truly be a vehicle to advance equity and inclusion?
Thank you, Lupe. And it's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to listen to my friend, the Lieutenant Governor, and she did an excellent job of outlining why she is optimistic about the potential, and I share her optimism. As Dr. Tyson and I wrote in an article that you mentioned, capitalism is really good at some things. It has been a driver of the largest decrease in human suffering across the planet in the last 2 decades than has happened in all of history. It's terrific at creating innovation and wealth, but it is not too good at dealing with externalities, particularly in today's world, issues around climate change, and it's not particularly good at funding public goods like education and healthcare. It is also without appropriate legal and political structure around it. It creates inequality in ways that are deeply troubling and does not encourage the level of economic mobility and equality across geography, race, gender, et cetera, that unless it is regulated to do so. So my basic view is this is all true before COVID. And as the great statistics that Genevieve showed, COVID has only exacerbated those issues in the United States. And so what the challenge is what you outlined, which is how do we ensure that capitalism continues to do what it is great at, which is innovation, productivity improvement, growth, opportunity for new products and services, but that it is through all the mechanisms that we have, including our political system, ensure that it is addressing and forced to address the issues of internalizing its externalities, that we have a mechanism to fund public goods, and that we think deeply and aggressively about how we address issues of inequality and opportunity. So I think that's all possible. I think it's all the more crucial that as we think about the hopefully sooner rather than later ending of this pandemic, that we don't, as you said in the material that Genevieve presented early, we aren't just talking about going back to what we had, but that we're really thinking about building back better. And that's a big challenge in front of us.
Thanks, Lenny. Marcela, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I mean, first of all, Guadalupe, let me start by thanking you. Thank Dean Harrison and Genevieve and Egal Kelly for having me today with Lenny. It's a privilege. And to Lieutenant Governor, who presented really a theory of change, which we adhere. I think that probably what I can share is what it has been a little bit of our journey. When I came to Unilever, it was in 2013. We have a CEO who we all share the belief that we wanted to build a company that represents a new form of capitalism, right? That serves and contribute to society, doesn't take from society, and that we can drive, and we are an enabler for that inclusive economic growth and job creation that was referred to before. So perhaps as a way to present that is Unilever distinguished itself for creating, the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. We talk about sustainable business. I mean, Dean Harrison talked about sustainability, inclusion, and innovation, which I think is a great framework for what we stand for. And when I came to Unilever, we were very well, comprehensive program in health and well-being and in climate, but we really needed to expand the social ambition. So in the USLP, we created 3 pillars, in which we spell out our specific goals. One was fairness in the workplace. It was all about human rights, and fair value distribution and living wage was a key component of that we wanted to take ourselves to task before asking others. The second pillar was opportunity for women, and it was all about the rights, the skills to succeed, and the opportunities for women, including simple issues like access to funding and to not just be about tokenism, but really participation. And there were 2 issues that were addressed today that really speak about that. Is, when we were talking about, elements of rights, one was safety for women, right? I mean, many of us are talking about, and you see it in much of the movement in US, the Me Too. Back then, we wanted to drive, not just to correct the wrong, but really drive and that key fundamental principle that unlocks the opportunity for women to participate. And the third pillar was about inclusive business. When you think about the base of the pyramid and really up, Lieutenant Governor talk about the strawberry pickers. I mean, or you talk about agriculture or mining. I mean, it's so instrumental that we look into that. It's just the foundation of the business. Without that, nothing can take place. So when we look into that, how we could activate and work, and not just the supply chain as sometimes is, but the value chain. What about the smaller scale retailers? Many economies are the drivers of the business activity, right? And the role of women in many of that goes from the right to own property to the right to access to many, as I highlighted before, funding of financing, or in many cases to have an ID that allows them to do that. So I think that COVID-19, as Lenny said, has expanded and highlighted this. And there's no questions. I think that the only thing I would like to also say, sometimes we are too long in goals and ambitions when you look into the SDGs and we look into Paris Agreement for climate and integrated with social issues, but we really need to focus on effective implementation.
Great, thank you for that. And I think both of your responses highlight this idea that Genevieve stated earlier, that we have to rebuild in disruptive and courageous ways. And moving to a new normal, we have to really think holistically on how do we rebuild an inclusive society. So switching gears a bit, one of the big issues that we saw in the research was the huge disparity between CEO pay and median worker pay. So CEOs are making 278 times their median worker, and in the past years, real pay for workers has stagnated, even decreased for Black men. In our playbook, one of the plays is around updating executive pay structures to be long-term, so that CEOs are not rewarded and incentivized under short-term metrics. The play also includes tying executive pay to diversity metrics. So for you, Lenny, a question I have is, what are the ways to move towards more long-term shareholder views of market returns and CEO incentives?
So there are several mechanisms that can help accelerate that process, but let me start with the most important framing, which is if you are a shareholder and a long-term shareholder, it is in your interest to ensure that all of those things are occurring. And so this should be a fundamental element of what the corporate objectives are, as well as linked to what executive compensation is, because that's in the longer term interest of both shareholders and stakeholders if this is properly addressed. So I think that among the levers that will move this even faster than is already occurring is, number one, it is being increasingly demanded by large institutional shareholders. So a large component of the shareholder base of US companies are index funds and long-term pension funds that are dependent on long-term returns and ensuring that they're not subject to unknown risks that alter the performance of a company. And so they are pushing for this aggressively. Secondly, I think there is a pressure that comes from an employee base. If you're in the talent markets, being able to credibly demonstrate that your company is aligned with those sorts of issues is important to be able to attract the kind of talent that is entering the workplace, as well as those that are currently employed. And lastly, I do think that there is increasing, although not as easily because it's less transparent and harder to do. There's consumer pressure, particularly in consumer-oriented goods, to be aligned with those sorts of issues. So all three of those things, I think, will encourage it. The last thing I'd say is, if you take a slightly longer-term view of this, to me, it's really important that our post-secondary institutions, particularly our management schools like Haas, really train the next generation to acknowledge and understand why what we are talking about is so important. They are having to overcome a generation that was my generation, that was trained and is now most of the leadership in corporate America, that the business of business was short-term shareholder returns. And unfortunately, that got embedded into a large component of how finance function and many executives think, and they just need to update and do their continuing education to understand that's not true. So I do think it's important that all of those things are pushing in a direction that is in the long-term interests of both business and society.
Great, thanks for sharing that, Lenny. And now to Marcela on the similar topic. In our playbook, we highlight how Unilever stopped reporting to shareholders on a quarterly basis and now only do so annually. The company linked quarterly reporting to drains on long-term investments. What are some of the impacts that your company has seen from this?
Yeah. So thank you, Guadalupe, for the question. I mean, I think that, Lenny, we adhere to your thinking on this, right? I think that Paul Polman distinguished himself when he came to Unilever by stopping the quarterly estimates. And what the quarterly estimates did is to create an speculative, feed into the speculation of the markets and sort of up and down and short-termism that Lenny addressed. So Paul was clear that because we wanted investors who believe on us and who believe in the long-term principles of sustainability and inclusion and innovation that Dean Harrison talked about, that we did not want to have that investment. So it's worth to highlight the point that I came slightly after he did that, but that the shares decrease its value. I mean, the first reaction of the financial market was, let us penalize the company, right? And thank goodness, what it followed was a recognition of the value of the company. And also accomplish what Lenny highlighted, this to leave out the speculation to the best of our ability. The second element, so that has been very good. The second element I want to highlight is that it speaks to the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan that I referred before, and that Lenny highlighted about how you recognize actual contributions, is the fact that the USLP have very specific targets. Our board of directors would only recognize, the contributions made by the company, financial but sustainable, if we hit those targets. In every single person in the company, we have regular targets but sustainability targets, and we need to meet that because it's directly linked to the performance. You don't meet those requirements, it's linked to your performance. And I think that what that have done is created that discipline as a company, but also as individual leaders from the bottom up and not just from the top down. And I think that for me was is critical to create the right culture in the company. And then the last thing, so the third and last thing I want to comment about it is our new ambition, which I know you're going to ask me with more detail, but we landed a couple of weeks ago. And we talk about raising living standards, right? To the comment of Lieutenant Governor and Dean Harrison and you, Lenny. We talk about raising living standards, and we tackle front and central the issue of a fair value distribution and living wage. Having accomplished and driven that and created the enablers for our operations throughout the many countries that we do, we had put it for suppliers, but we haven't really required and driven that. Now we do. And what we want to make sure is that that in whatever business we do, that will really help to raise the standards. And people who do, whether they are picking strawberries or they are working in a factory or working in any level, they should be making a living wage that helps raise their family from poverty. So that's the job that we are doing. But as Lenny will know, as an economist, it's not one company's job. It requires a community of action. And working with the stakeholders, we have been doing it, but we will continue doing it. And then I tease you, I told you it was the last thing, but the really, really last thing that we wanted to say was in diversity. The requirement, and this goes to all this of delivering all this, formulation of new capitalism. We set up ourselves to that challenge, and in our board of directors, external board of directors, we raise equity and at the same time gender parity. And at the same time, internally, what we said is it shouldn't be a token. We need to make sure that even in middle management, that we have that parity that we need to do. And we have done tremendous progress, particularly as the USLP matured as of December of last year. And even in functions that were historically more male-orientated, like supply chain or engineers, etc. But it required a lot of effort and making sure that it's a process that brings substance. So I stop there now, for real.
Thanks, Marcela. It's great to hear how Unilever is a model for businesses and sustainability and really thinking about society at large. So thank you for sharing that. We're going to switch gears a little bit to Lenny. So as Genevieve mentioned, COVID-19 has disproportionately affected low-income, Latinx, Black, Indigenous communities, as well as essential workers, such as restaurant workers and farm workers. And this is something that hits home and is very personal for me, as also the daughter of farm workers from Fresno, California. However, at the same time, people of color and women are less likely to have healthcare, insurance, and benefits. And we had a question on the panel about vaccine distribution, and there's some early data that shows disproportionate access to the vaccine in the hardest hit communities, So how can businesses potentially in partnership with government and the social sector begin to rebuild a more equitable approach to healthcare to address these health disparities?
So the first most important thing is intentionality and alignment, that's a priority. As we were talking about before, without clarity around what's trying to be accomplished, both from a business standpoint, as Unilever, as Marcela mentioned, has long been a leader in demonstrating how that's possible and important. And also, I suspect that they've found that as they articulate those objectives and not do quarterly earnings, that you have different sets of shareholders that you're happier to have than the ones who are speculating quarter to quarter. So it's an important business objective that can be aligned to accomplish those. But it's also important that businesses aggressively encouraging that activity from a policy standpoint. So when Governor Newsom became governor of California, he outlined that his overarching objective was California for all. How that got translated into economic policy was about trying to ensure, much like Haas's objectives are, that we want to sustain the innovation and performance and growth of the state, but it needs to be much more inclusive geographically, inclusive demographically, inclusive by gender, and that it needs to be both innovative and inclusive, and then sustainable and resilient to what is coming, with a particular focus on climate change as an urgent matter. And you see that embedded in a whole series of things, not the least of which is budget priorities, a set of objectives that, given the scale of California, things that it does in things like auto emission standards, move global markets. And then finally, what it does with its own workforce and its purchasing and grants that it gives to ensure things like that they will only purchase zero emission vehicles, that they ensure that contractors are offering living wages, that the priorities from the budget, including some of the elements that the Lieutenant Governor mentioned, are real and sincere, because those are budgets or statements of your values. So I think there's a role that business plays as they're within their own institutions, within their ecosystem, and they also have a very important voice in the policy debate to say that these are things that are in the interest of the economy and business for longer term performance, and it needs to be important elements of policy priorities.
Great, thank you. And it gets back to what the Lieutenant Governor says about how government can do it alone. We also need the buy-in of businesses. Thank you, Lenny. And Marcela, did you want to add to that, or do you want to tell us about social ambition before we move to a few questions we have from the Q&A?
Well, I think that to what Lenny said, I will just also want to add up the flip side, right? If you look into living wage at the global scale, in many places, it has been my experience that particularly the concept of minimum wage or living wage has been manipulated as an investment or trade policy. So what Lenny highlighted is, the voice that we all need to have to make sure that we work together and support governments. But I would say the opposite is equally true. I mean, they has to be aligned. But I have been in situations where governments feel that it will be detrimental for them to implement any such policy because they feel that regionally maybe in comparative disadvantages. So that means, and that talks about the interlinked dynamics of the markets, right? It has to be the commitment of business, but also the commitments of governments to drive it together. I am an eternal optimist. Otherwise, I wouldn't, we wouldn't be able to. I wouldn't be able to do this job. So I think that is really quite critical. And when we talk about all these issues coming to the table, as difficult as those conversations are, and for us also even internally and with others to come up to the conclusions of our ambition, it was a very extensive discussion. So I think that we need to make all efforts to include all the voices in the discussion. So I stop there. I don't know if when you want me to talk about the social ambition, you let me know.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe just like a very quick highlight. We do have one question in the Q&A that I'd like to get to before we close out. Thanks, Marcela.
You're welcome. Oh, you want me to go with the social ambition? Okay, very good. Yeah. So I mentioned before that the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan matured in December 2020. So we have been working for the last 3 years to really say, okay, what is our next ambition? We really wanted to focus in the two critical issues that the world has to tackle. One being climate and environment, which we landed the ambition last year, and inequality. So in terms of what we call the social ambitions, and I already mentioned the fact that we want to make sure, in the way that we articulated, we wanted to make sure to ensure that everyone who directly provides goods and services to the company earns at least a living wage or living income. And we say at least a minimum living wage or living income, because it shouldn't be the roof, it should be the base, the foundation in what to build for. We also committed to really diversify and to spend, starting with 2 billion annually with suppliers that are owned and managed by underserved communities, to make sure that they are part of a critical part of our supply chain, and to continue expanding. And then we talk about pioneering models for new employment models for our employees, and supporting and help train the next generation of young people who are coming to the ranks of employment. And probably when you look at everything that we want to do, we also, 2 weeks ago, we issue our human rights report. And I think that is the third report. And what is important for us is how we want to demonstrate what we do, the approach that we have, that we don't want to have a separate program. We want to have business driving that. We believe that that is the foundation of our business. And how else? I mean, we don't want to have this functional society. If we want to have respect of human rights, that should be a non-negotiable, right? But yet we know that in many societies and parts of the world, we really need to step up. And I think at the core of what Lenny said, if companies should be, and business should be a vehicle for positive transformation. And you need to have the courage in many places, and you need to make sure and be very cognizant of what are the limitations to cascade over time, because you don't want to put people arms, as you cascade many of the things that we believe and our values that we believe globally. So I think that we have been in that report, you can see what has been our journey and how we are doing it and how we are committed to do it in the future. For me, the exciting part of it is that if you look into any company putting products or services in the market, if you were to take an X-ray of that product or service, that X-ray should tell you that they are climate friendly and that they are socially responsible, and that they put those two together, not that they sacrifice the climate agenda for the social agenda or the social agenda for the climate. We need to stop the silos. We need to bring them together. And I think that is another element that we are there to, that we want to demonstrate. I mean, we used to say, even when Paul was here and now Alan, our new CEO, we said, sustainable business have growth at a much better rate, meaning it's not critical mass. I mean, the markets still need to embrace that concept, but sustainable business have been much better performance than regular business. So when people said to me, well, how do you measure, how do you do? Of course, you can have very complex, mechanisms to do that, but what a better signal that those business are the healthier business that we are driving. And that, I think that it links very much to, Lenny, what you have, drive in your different roles, but also what we want to do and what California is trying to do. I think that Lieutenant Governor talked about how, certain investments can be, are right now being, placed to help the most vulnerable, but that's not long-term viable. And there is a research that was really very interesting as part of all the studies that we were doing, that was done by Oxford University. And the survey done by this professor asked, a group of people, you can have this amount of money, but you don't need to work. You can sort of dedicate yourself to whatever you want to do, or you can have this money, but you need to work and you need to do X, Y, and Z, whatever was the job. And the largest majority chose the second option. Why? Because they want to have a sense of productivity, contribution, and to be a member of the society by driving these processes. So from a business point of view, we need to create those opportunities. People want less, all of us, we talk about less plastic, less waste or no waste, and circular economy. And those opportunities for innovation will create new jobs. And we need to make sure that we channel, everyone into that new business economy. So stop there.
Thank you, Marcela. And unfortunately, we are out of time. Apologies to the folks that added a question to the Q&A. At this point, I'd like to take time to thank Lenny and Marcela for joining us this morning. It was a great conversation. Dean Harrison, as well as Lieutenant Governor. And on behalf of the Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership, thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Guadalupe, Dean Harrison, and Genevieve, and Lenny. A pleasure to share with you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, everybody. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.